Welcome to SQL Server 2012, Always On Availability Groups in Action. What I'm going to try to demo for you today in less than 15 minutes, I'm going to try to keep it around 10 to 12 minutes, is SQL Server 2012, brand new feature of Always On Availability Groups from the perspective of a user, someone who is going to be interacting with the database from an application business user perspective. Because at the end of the day, always on availability groups is a high availability option, but that's just, that's providing database continuity and high availability, which is very important. But how does that affect your end users and the folks who are using something like this report builder? If they're designing reports or if they're viewing reports, they need to continue to do business, have business continuity without interruption. Whether that's if you are, if there's a server outage, or if you're, if it's a planned outage, if you're patching or doing things like that. So I'm not going to go into details of the implementations of Always On Availability Groups. I'll save that for another time. I want to keep this from the perspective of how this affects what you do from an application database administration perspective. I should note that Always On Availability Groups combines, in a way, database mirroring and clustering in SQL Server. Database mirroring is replicated as of this version of SQL Server. So it is recommended that you start moving toward always on availability groups. You don't need to be a cluster server admin, in my opinion, to enable and to configure always on. I'm not a cluster server admin. My background is architecture, DBA, and developer, and I was able to set this up on my system. I don't have any servers here, so there's no there's no tricks, there's no magic behind the curtain. I have these 3 nodes here instead on Hyper-V, all running from my single laptop here. I have a domain controller and 2 nodes that are part of a cluster. And to create this cluster, it was very simple. I just enabled the, here we go, on the domain controller, I just enabled the feature of failover cluster. And I created a very simple cluster without any shared storage, nothing like that. I just needed to give it a name, and then I have 2 nodes join into that cluster. So SQL Server must be part of a cluster, so the servers within a single availability group must be in the same domain. And you do not need to install SQL Server as a failover cluster instance. You simply lay down a regular installation of SQL Server, and then you enable it as an always on availability group node. So you can see that all I did was just create a cluster called AWAG1, and then on each of the, and I also should say that I enabled DNS as well, and I would be actually over here on the domain controller to show you that. So I enable DNS, and so you'll see the IP addresses for the cluster and for the nodes. Keep note of that sales app name there in DNS. It's very important. That is because the way that high availability and failover is handled within availability groups and always on is much better than in database mirroring. You don't need to have a connection string any longer from your application that has 2 separate, a primary and a secondary server host name. That's all handled automatically now through cluster server within always on availability groups. Alright, so here's a dashboard within SQL Server Management Studio, and when you create a availability group, and there's actually a wizard, and it's very simple to create the configurations in SQL Server. SQL Server will talk to the cluster server API within Windows Server, so you don't need to know the commands for cluster server. And what you do is you then create a availability group with more than one database, so in more than one replica. So whereas today, or previously in database mirroring with SQL Server, what you had with database mirroring was that you had a one-to-one, you had a primary and a secondary server, and you had only one database at a time. You can now have multiple databases, so your entire set of databases for a single application can reside in one single availability group, and you can have multiple replicas. I don't have enough horsepower here on my laptop to show you that, but so I only have 2 nodes, but I have 2 databases. I have AdventureWorks and AdventureWorks Data Warehouse, both within my availability group. And here's a brand new object you'll see in SQL 2012 called a listener. I called my listener sales app because this will be registered SQL Server will register this for you as a virtual host name in cluster server, which means that your users, the report user, which is part of our demo here, that report user will only have to connect into Sales App at any time. It doesn't matter where the app resides within your infrastructure. SQL Server will resolve to there. So you'll see there's that IP address. I use a static IP address for my listener. You don't have to do that. I just don't have DHCP enabled. When you walk through your configuration of either the wizard or create manually an availability group in SQL Server, you will have that option. So what that means then is that that eliminates the need for a witness server of database smearing and to have a connection string with multiple host names in it. You just use one, and it can be a logical name like Sales App, and that is just what you use from a user perspective. It's very, very nice there. Now you'd also, by the way, I'm managing this here from a separate management studio, not from any of those node servers back there, because it's is best practice to manage those not from these servers themselves. So here I am as a report user. Now I can put that Sales App right in there as if it were a host name within my data source. And because it is essentially a host name, right, it's in my DNS, so I can connect to it, and SQL Server will use the cluster server capability in Windows to resolve that, no matter where I happen to have that running. Notice I'm using OLADB for the connection string, for the connection manager here. And the reason for that is because you'll see under Advanced that you can have an option now of having those replicas, those secondaries, the multiple secondaries in that availability group can be read-only. So I don't have that set here, but you could change that read write to read only, meaning that previously, in database mirroring, the secondary could not be read from. It was only there for high availability, for disaster recovery, and now you can have it as a read only. So let's run this and let's see how this works now. In this case, I'm just connecting into that Sales App, and I've created a report, and I have no idea where that server actually is. But as you can see, I can run the report, and it works just fine. A very, very simple report, just to give you a demo here for this purpose. And we'll go back here. And now, let's actually fail this over. So if there were some kind of a failure or I needed to do this manually, this would not affect the users because you don't have to change the connection string. That being said, of course, during the failover, the transactions would fail. The application, if it wants to have zero loss, would need to be aware that it needs to retry. That's all it has to do. So you don't have to go through any longer. You don't have to do like you did in database mirroring. You have to go and read the secondary host name and the connection string. But you do need to retry anyway. So I'm actually probably going to go over to directly on one of the nodes to run this. And the reason is just because here on my laptop, with my being on a separate domain from the servers, yeah, I don't have my, I'll try this, but I don't have my domains trusted. So what you want to do is make sure that you have the authentication to do a failover. When you do a manual failover like this, so I'm not going to mimic a server failure. Instead, I'm going to do a manual failover. What happens is you need to authenticate. You need to have the admin privilege on the server to even do this. Let's just skip doing it from here. I'm going to go directly to, I'll go directly to one of the nodes here in my cluster. Right into Management Studio. Again, I'm not going to go in a cluster server to do this. Everything is managed and monitored directly from SQL Server Management Studio. Let's go into Node 2, which, as you saw from my dashboard, this is currently the primary within my availability group. So I'm just going to right-click this time and do the failover from here. You can also failover from the dashboard. Right, I'm going to go to my Fast Track Data Warehouse. So I just click Next on here. And here's where I'm going to authenticate as an administrative user on that node, and we'll click Next and Finish, and this is going to fail over. So let's take a look at the details here. As we walk through the failover, it's going to validate, and then it's going to perform the failover. So all the databases are being kept in sync. I have these as a synchronous partnership, very similar to what you have within database mirroring in previous versions of SQL Server. And so again, you can have multiple replicas too. In mine only have two. Let's go over to the other replica and take a look at this as this is failing over. We can probably, I don't know if I'm might not be fast enough to actually catch it because again, I just have the two databases. Yeah, in fact, there it is. It's already done. So we'll close that. And as you can see now, it's showing as the secondary. So we had a successful failover. We'll go back and we'll refresh our dashboard here on the my SQL Server Management Studio from a client that I'm watching my availability group. I only have one, so you get that shows up here on your dashboard. I'm gonna drill down into that, and you'll see, yep, there we go. So Fast Track Data Warehouse is now the primary, and SQL Node 2 is a secondary. That's very, very easy to do. So this could be something that you use for your patching, for example. I'm a report user. I'm going to rerun my reports, and there you go. No difference. I didn't have to change anything. So you don't have to go through and make any changes to clients, to applications when you do a failover with AlwaysOn Availability Groups. All right, so there we go. Where are we at? We're about 10 minutes. I think I came close to my time. So I appreciate you watching today, and till next time, good luck.